So I didn't know.
How about mine?
We're good and we're live. Hey
Welcome
everyone.
in, guys.
That odd moment right before you go live, they were like, if we're live, if we're not live, but here we are. To talk about a really exciting topic when you are growing a business, and that's finding more freedom in your private practice. Many reasons for why you're probably launching and trying to grow your own business as an entrepreneur right now as a therapist is because you weren't finding the levels of freedom and the level of separation from the day-to-day rigor, either because the income wasn't there, the control wasn't there, the freedom and control to receive the full part of your income. There's lots of driving motivations to launch a solo or become a group practice or whatever it is. And so I think there's two purposes for today's session. One, it's if you haven't thought through the stages of separation, the stages of freedom that you could achieve as a result of being a business owner, I actually kind of want to present the opportunity, the freedom opportunity, as we would call it, by building a bigger business, by building a better business, and by becoming a better business, better practice owner. When you successfully build a private practice, it affords you some much needed separation. But along the way, if you're already part of the way through this process, if you understand, hey, my private practice is a vehicle for freedom, is a vehicle for the income, for the lifestyle, for the impact that I want to make, we're going to share some process points on how to move from kind of one step to another more quickly, more easily. And we're going to start at the bottom from solo practice, becoming a solo practice, all the way up to the point of like selling your practice and or achieving ultimate freedom in the stages that exist in between, from zero to group practice to, multimillionaire potentially. Let's dive in. Attilio, let's talk about that transition from zero to solo practice a little bit. This is kind of the first big stage of separation. You are now actually launching the business. And unfortunately, from my perspective, you actually have even more responsibility and less freedom than ever before when you first launched the business.
Yeah, this is that transition from employee to self-employed, right? Employee to self-employed. And so now you're responsible for everything. The interesting thing, the way that I like to think of this is like you own your job, right? You own your job. So you get all the upside, but you also get all the downsides of having to do all of the things for that job, AKA acquiring customers, dealing with onboarding customers, dealing with offboarding, dealing with everything in between, the client experience, coming up with how you provide care, coming up with everything and everything. So this is an interesting stage because it feels like there's a million decisions to make. This is an interesting stage because you don't know a lot. You've probably never done the thing before to the fullest extent.
Never built
And
a business before.
yeah, and quite frankly, you're just uncomfortable with everything. So you're uncomfortable with everything because you've never done the thing before, and so you have feelings of uncertainty. You have feelings of inadequacy. You have feelings of uh, just kind of like overwhelm, I'd say, because there's so many options and there's so much information out there for directions you could take.
Yeah, it's kind of like drinking out of a fire hose. And if you've never attempted that, right, it's not necessarily a fun experience because there's a million things you've never done before coming at you, just as Attilio said. But you do get some initial freedom. You have a little bit more control over your schedule, probably, right? You can say, hey, I'm going to work a 12-hour day on Saturday and a 0-hour day on Monday, and you can make transitions like that even in this initial phase. And then the next transition is saying, hey, I've figured out enough that I am making a full-time income off of my private practice. It's now just not just a launch. It's now not just a whatever, but I don't need any supplemental income to live my lifestyle separate from my business. This typically means a full or a mostly full caseload. There could be some other fun transitions still as a solo practice, launching a group, becoming cash pay, just having some more control over rates or process or other things. But ultimately, in terms of transition points, you've experienced some really big freedom where you own your business and you own the entire source of income. Obviously, you're going to have taxes and expenses, but you figured out the responsibility factor to say, hey, I can make 60, 80, 200K a year as a solo practice provider without relying on anyone else. And, in some ways, like, bravo, like snaps and claps, because that is not a process that many therapists do, but there's not actually as many people as you might think in this world that successfully build a business and can earn their primary income consistently off of it, much less move to some of these other stages that we're talking about. And I think sometimes, I just want to dispel a process as we talk about the rest of these stages. You can stop at any point and be really satisfied, fulfilled, and achieve some of your core life desires. I think there's this definition of what success looks like sometimes. And so I don't want to like impose on you that you have to transition from solo to group practice or earn more than 150K a year, anything like that, because it's what you want out of life. And it's what the freedom, the separation your business can buy you, what matters most to you before launching to other things. Because just like you can achieve deeper forms of separation and freedom, that usually requires the initial acceptance of more responsibility. Just like to get the freedom you have now, potentially, it required you to initially take the responsibility of the entire business on your shoulders.
Yeah. This first step is, getting full. That in some ways means you have some mastery on something. You're doing something right. And so I'd like to maybe take a second for you to acknowledge that and see maybe what is going right, and why is it going right. And maybe it's a fluke. Sometimes it is a fluke, and sometimes it's not. And so maybe that kind of points you in the direction of the next problems that you have to solve,
Yeah.
as you sort of move up this ladder.
Yeah.
And so, like Josh said, money's a tool, and money's a tool that lets you buy options, and that's what we perceive as freedom here, right? It's
Yeah.
options to do whatever we want, right? Serve people in whatever capacity we want. And so, if you want more options at this time, the easy option is the transition to this next stage, which is maybe like possibly bringing on your first administrator. So
Yeah.
leverage some of your money that you are making to essentially um, delegate tasks, lower income earning tasks than what you could be earning. So instead of you taking the 1 to 2 hours to do the intake calls or the initial sales contacts or the following up or whatever, you're buying someone else's time. You're buying someone else's time to do that activity. And so by buying someone else's time, you buy back your time. So now you don't have to do that task for 10 hours a week. You have someone else do that task, and maybe it takes them 20 hours a week to do the task as efficiently or effectively as you. But you're still paying considerably less, and you get to spend those hours on more income producing activities.
For sure.
AKA, you get to kind of fill up the rest of your time if you want. And then this is also that time where you get to make a great decision on, hey, is it time to hire another therapist or not? And so
Yeah.
usually this administrator point and this first therapist point, there's kind of like a little bit of back and forth. Which one should you do first? And maybe there's a right answer in some cases. Josh, I don't know if you have an opinion on which one maybe goes first, but
Yeah, I think we see this depending on sort of how much profit you're making as a solo practice. And that depends a little bit on your income needs for your lifestyle currently. We know some practice owners, they're making 12K a month as their solo practice, but anything extra beyond their costs to run the practice is like going straight to family and mortgage essentially, which means there's not a lot of bandwidth to spend an extra grand a month on an admin team or something like that. So you still have to continue to leverage your own time, your own resources to make the future jumps. Other individuals, right? They're making 12,000 a month. They're living off of like 7 or 8, and there's like $4,000 of free cash flow that isn't super important to their day-to-day needs. And so they're going to say, hey, I want to buy back some of my time so I can afford some of these growth transitions. And so values, profit margin. Obviously, the sooner you can get admin tasks that don't, excite you a lot or attribute heavily to the growth of the business is going to be better. And then you have that next big transition point. And this is also where your business model changes. How you get compensated when you hire your first clinician is fundamentally different than when you're a solo practice. You are being compensated by filling someone else's caseload and making sure that they're taken care of and they can complete their sessions and lead them through that and fill that out and run that business. You're using someone else's time to generate income. And it's kind of a whole different game versus using your own time to fulfill your own service, right? And this is really where the business model becomes exciting because the better you can onboard new clinicians and the better you can keep them full and keep that process running is hire a new clinician and sustain them and keep them full, which is the primary sort of action or back and forth point. Everything else that you do in a group practice is just to facilitate that major action. Get a clinician, fill them up. Get a clinician, fill them up, right? Like that's the action to continue to grow this. And along the way, you can continue to leverage yourself, your own time, your own skills, or you can continue to leverage other people's times and skills on the way up. But if you hire one single other clinician, you probably can't live, right? Or even get your primary income. So the next transition point when you go group practice that I think is really important is when you are making more than 50% of your like day-to-day lifestyle needs. So let's say you live on 8K a month, right? For just all of your primary needs in life, when you're making 4 or 5,000, more than 50% off of the work that your clinicians are doing in your practice alone. Hey, I've got 3, 4, 5 clinicians. They're all full based off of my percentage splits with my team. They're generating me $4,000 to $5,000 in profit on a monthly basis. Why is this really important, Attilio? Why is this transition point something to really like look at and measure by?
This is kind of like the cascade. This is the avalanche point. This is the tipping point. But this is also one of the most awkward stages for a private practice because you're not making enough money for you to stop taking um, sessions, maybe, but you're also not maybe making enough money to like really aggressively move into like the full group practice model. And so it's a little bit of an awkward stage. And so for those of you who are in this stage, I want to affirm it's a weird stage.
Yeah.
You're making a little bit more money, but you have a lot of responsibility, and maybe it feels like you're stretched in 30 different directions. And maybe it feels like sometimes things work and sometimes things don't work. And honestly, it's because you don't have economies of scale working for you. And so you still have very much a small practice. You still very much do not have the amount of cash coming in to be able to uh, buy things in bulk. We'll call it buy things in bulk and use things in bulk. And so the profits don't really exist quite like they need to be for how much work maybe you're putting in. And this is also one of those stages where you're not doing enough right that there's overwhelming success. And so you still have a lot of things that are just like wrong. And quite frankly, you can have like some mini success. Like this is like, hey, I have 3 clinicians. They're like 30 to 60% full, and I'm making a little bit of money, but I have to figure out how to get more marketing going, or I have to figure out. And so there's still so many things that you just don't know, and you haven't been able to make the transition on so many fronts. It's a very new group practice ownership segment.
Yeah. And this is also the stage that is probably the most noisy, like
Mm.
almost like there's a bunch of sound machines in the room with you, and you're trying to like talk over and get over it because it kind of feels like a messy process. Because as Tilly said, maybe you're feeling like you're getting pulled in 30 directions. As a result, though, this is also the stage that new group practice owners or group practice owners in general get stuck in most often, is never successfully getting on the other side of reducing their caseload to 0. And there's probably 2 big reasons for this. Number one is you don't actually want to reduce your caseload to 0. And because of that, actually, you're keeping either too large of a caseload, or you don't understand that maybe you need to reduce that caseload to 0 to force the transitions in the business to then only add caseload back in at a later point once it becomes a proper use of your resources. When you're trying to grow out of the stage, when your energy is being spent 10, 20, 30 hours a week on one-to-one sessions with clients, the emotional, energetic draw on that of using your best skill, your best time, and your best energy is pretty massive. And one of the only ways to sort of get out of this hole is to put that creative energy and that emotional energy into building the business to 8 clinicians, to 10 clinicians, in order for that to be a self-sustaining entity, because you need that money to hire the admin staff. You need that money to not need to take a clinical session in a single week. And so if we had to make a recommendation, even if you don't want to like say goodbye to clinical sessions for the rest of your life, you might need to stop for 3 months or 6 months. And it's typically when practice owners get really serious about, how do I reduce my session load all the way down to zero? And I can always add it back in later once I can essentially afford to. Some of you think, hey, how can I not afford to continue to take my sessions? That's how I'm getting paid. But we have to understand our business model has changed here for how you get paid, and that's filling other people out, and that's building a self-sustaining team. So that's the next big transition, is you can afford to take 0 clinical sessions in a week or in a month, right? Where you can live off of the month-to-month income that your private practice is essentially making, or the quarterly income that your private practice is making, that usually requires somewhere between 6 and 12 clinicians, just depending on profit margins and lifestyle, or you're getting to be right around that 7-figure, 60 to 100K on a monthly basis of cash collected.
Yeah, this is another noisy area. For those of you who maybe don't have someone helping you out here, this is an interesting area because you have money now and you have time. So you have a little bit of both here, uh, which means you have a lot of options. And so if you have a lot of options, I I think the most frequent thing that we see is people looking for more things to do. And that's actually the exact opposite of what you need to be doing right now. This is the time where you need to hunker down and stay consistent and create consistency and create um, really those like standard operating procedures for your practice. This is how we go about doing things. This is
Yeah.
how our administration uh, systematizes its XYZ. This is how I'm starting to understand the data from my practice. This is how I'm starting to understand. And so what we want to do is start understanding our business here. This is also the time to not get creative. This is the time to just keep doing what you are doing.
Yeah.
And so in a lot of cases, this is like silence. Something is working. We just have to keep doing that. And we're not big enough yet that we can um, maybe like pay to solve all of our problems with like big level employees, right? So this
Right.
is like still you have to solve the problems for your practice, and you have to create consistency, and you have to create the environment here for your success.
Yeah. As you're growing through and out of this stage, the solution to create more separation in your practice is going to be marked by vendors, marked by new team members, and marked by automation and systematization of improvements of the current process, right? So it's sort of like, hey, our intake process is kind of like a leaky pipe right now. It works, it gets the water to the side, it gets the clients over the hump, on the calendar, scheduled, but that process can be drastically improved and accelerated. And there are a number of things that you could do at that single point to make it measurably grown, and then move the business up and out from there. So you're kind of in this stage for a while, and it depends a little bit on your desired income needs and your desired level of the practice. I think next big separation point is when you get it down to like 10-ish hours a week, you notice a massive or huge difference, because you could either work 1 or 2 days a week, or like 1 or 2 hours a day at this segment of things, and your life is yours. Sort of like Attilio said, hey, you're looking for more things to do, but there might not be more things to do. There just might be more improvements to make, more actions to do. Hire more clinicians, bring in more team members, do the additional admin staff. And it just depends on your intensity here. You can dip into more profit margin by having someone do the clinical supervision, or have someone do your billing, or have someone do your credentialing, things that you might have done when you were in that 0 to 10 clinician phase, or that 0 to 15 clinician phase. And saying, hey, can I create processes to get these off of my plate? Might not even grow the business, but it will keep the business exactly where it's at with less of my day-to-day involvement. And then we have the next mark of separation is you can afford those higher level employees that will also create systems and processes for you, as well as create even more separation. So this turns in from 10 hours a week, maybe like 1 or 2 times a month where you're checking on the business. Very much becomes an asset that you own and manage, rather than a business that, or a private practice you're running and operating to some degree or another.
Yeah, this is our time when you might see profits drop down a little bit, but that's because you're spending on keeping something that you hold on to. So there's a very
Yeah.
big difference here between you running the practice, and maybe that makes a little bit more profits, versus you just like managing this asset, right? And so maybe that means you're spending a little bit more money. And so this is maybe where you want to just be clear on your goals and your desires and your needs and your wants, and what makes the best organization for you, for your team, and your clients, right?
Yeah.
And your clinicians' clients. And so make a great experience, do something you're proud of, and there's going to be some wiggle room on maybe profits versus uh, managerial needs here.
Yeah. And we've seen practice owners successfully exit the like sort of full day-to-day of their business at about 10 clinicians as kind of the first benchmark. Between like 10 and like 20 clinicians is typically a segment where, again, depending on reimbursement rates, profit margins, some of those things, where you could afford the team to help manage and run a lot of the day-to-day. And that's, anywhere before that, there's probably just not enough cash to sort of run the machine without your heavy involvement. But we've also seen practice owners stay viscerally attached to their business all the way up to 30 clinicians, 60 clinicians, and beyond. And so some of this is like preference now, is how aggressive do I want to get, and how much cash do I want to have on the other side of my freedom, the other side of my segment, right? Because if I exit my business at 20 clinicians in the day-to-day cycle of things, well, it's probably not going to grow significantly. It's going to maybe grow just a little bit measurably, and that's it's a stable process then, most likely. Well, you're sort of stuck with, hey, it generates 300K a year in free cash flow for me personally, right? It's not going to go too far above that over the next 3 to 5 years. So that's why some practice owners say, no, I'm going to grow this to 30 clinicians or 60 clinicians before I aggressively do the work. But each time you get bigger, how many systems, how many admin team members, the processes you have to put in place to successfully exit your brain from the business, that threshold becomes higher and higher, and you have to become even better at running the day-to-day business and removing yourself from the day-to-day business if you one day want to see that operation. And then we get to the final stage. Either you have like a CEO or like a managing partner who truly is like doing the full day-to-day, like you don't even think about this business. You are a silent partner in your own business for whatever percentage you own, and you check in on it sort of like a portfolio 1 to 2 times a year, and or you sell the business. Therapy practices will sell anywhere from like 2 to 10 times the multiple of what you are doing on a cash flow level. So $1 million practice probably sells for anywhere from like 2 to 10 million, depending on how fast you're growing, what the profit margins are, tons of variables, states, process, who's the buyer, all of those things. But you can just exit your business. And obviously, the larger the practice, if you're doing 5 million or 10 million annually, the multiples will go up from there.
Yeah, I think the last component in here is this is also a really interesting time where you get to do a lot of other cool things. You have a lot of the money, you've got maybe the time, you have clearly mastered the art of recruiting and filling clinicians. And so, if you so feel like it, you could do other like scale activities. So put together put together, horizontal expansion. So this maybe like it's time to start doing e-prescribes. It's start doing other elements, like maybe these elements increase your profits, and maybe it's like that next new challenge. I
Yeah.
think so many, and I was actually going to bring this up maybe a little bit earlier, but so many solos, so many small clinicians try to do like 2 or 3 different ways to increase their income, but it's actually like a complexity rather than just like, yeah, I'm just going to put this thing together and start making more profit. It doesn't quite work like that. And so this is maybe that time where it's like, it's interesting to start looking at horizontal expansion. You have the power of 60 clinicians powering your mistakes and powering your research and development on certain aspects. And so this is that time where scaling through media, scaling through brand, scaling through other things other than just square footage could exist.
Yeah.
This is also maybe like the safest space for that to sort of happen.
Yeah. And I think as we're thinking about like freedom and separation from the business, at the end of the day, you're going to be doing something. You're going to be filling your 24 hours a day with something. And right now, when you're growing your business, it's probably filled with way more of the business than you want it to be filled with. Having this vision and understanding, I go for runs a lot. And for me, at different points in my run, I have when I'm going to sprint and then when I'm going to just like take my regular speed. And there are times in your business where it's going to make sense to sprint, specifically to sprint to the next stage of separation. Because until you reach the ultimate stage of separation, of either managing it from afar or selling it, you are viscerally attached to this business some way, somehow. But sometimes it becomes really hard if you don't realize how far away you are, what it's actually going to take to just see a little bit more separation from the business so you can work on other things in your life, like your family or other businesses, whatever it is. So I just encourage you, identify what stage you're at, identify what the next stage of freedom could look like for you and what it would take to sprint to that stage. And then you can be in that stage for a little while naturally as it grows into whatever else you want. But sometimes sprinting for a short amount of time, a couple months, a year, whatever it is, to reach that next stage of separation. And that's a lot of what we do at Therapy Flow is we massively increase the speed of a practice owner inside of our program to get to that next stage of separation. So some people, they're going from 50 hours a week in their practice of 20 plus people. And it's not about adding 10 more clinicians. It's about going down to 30 hours a week, right? And for other people, it's saying I have 1 clinician or 0 clinicians on my team, and I have no income separation to take a week off of my life because all my sessions disappear. So I need to figure out how to sprint to hire my first 3 clinicians so I can have a little bit of control in that first step of freedom in my life. Either way, that's what we exist for. And I just encourage you to look through it through that lens, because when you get over to that other side of the hump, you can maintain that for a little while and enjoy that next stage of freedom a little bit before you have to like push again or push really hard.
Yeah. I don't think I have anything else to add, guys.
We hope this helps.
Gosh.
Let us know in the comments if you have any questions. Cheers.